welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello and welcome to Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Meghan Fangman, one of your hosts from the Children's Department, and I have a very special guest here today for you. We have author Tae Keller, who is the Newbery Award winning author of When You Trap a Tiger, and she has a brand new novel that has just come out. Jennifer Chan is Not Alone. So welcome, Tae. We are so happy to have you on the podcast here today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So can you tell us a little bit about your new book?
Sure. So Jennifer Chan is Not Alone is a book about bullying in middle school. It's about asking big questions about what we do when we hurt people and how we can help people, what we do when we make mistakes and how to fix those mistakes. And it's also about aliens because one of the characters, Jennifer Chan, is bullied for believing in aliens.
So I just finished reading this book last night, and I'm going to be recommending it to all my friends. They're already huge fans of yours and are patrons to the library, but I love this book. I loved how you blended the genres. I thought it was so interesting seeing things from like the cool kids' perspective of things, because I feel like sometimes we don't get a well-rounded perspective of middle school. So I really appreciated that. I love the main character, Mallory, and I loved how it's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what gave you the inspiration with the aliens? Like, how did that all come about?
Sure. Well, thank you for saying all that. It's kind of nerve-wracking when a book comes out because I'm not sure if people are going to like it. So it's nice to hear. But with the aliens piece of it, I knew that I wanted to talk about bullying. It's largely inspired by my own experience being bullied in middle school. And so I had that piece of it, and I had the piece of these big questions about where we find our place, both in the middle school social structures and also in the broader world. And I was thinking about an element to balance that out. So those are really heavy topics and questions, and I wanted something fun. And I was thinking about lots of different ideas, and I don't really know where aliens came from, but I thought of aliens. And as soon as I thought of that, I thought, oh, this is really exciting because I didn't know anything about it. I didn't really know anything about space. So I liked the idea of being able to learn something new for research for this book. And then it ended up working really well with Jennifer's feeling of being alienated in school and how she feels like she's different from everybody else and she's trying to find her place.
And I thought that, yeah, that was something that really struck out to me. I'm like, this is such an interesting idea of, talking about something. And she just moves from Chicago. Jennifer moves from Chicago to Florida and Norwell, Florida. Norwell, Florida. And so she's alienated, I feel like she feels alienated from the other students because she's coming from a different place too. And I also like how you talk about identity. Some of the characters, like either it's like going through, now that they're 12 years old, they're in middle school. It's also, the book speaks about identity, also cultural identity, and also your identity in school. So I think that was a great blend of different things and how you tied in, the alien aspect of it. I love Jennifer, the journal entries, like when Jennifer, goes missing, but we try to find out what's going on and we get her journal entries. And it's just interesting to see because we learn about her backstory, and it's interesting that we don't get everything at once and you find out more as you keep reading. And I thought that was so interesting, blending that, because it could have easily been like a missing, person story. And then, but how you blended that, it was like almost thinking to myself, like, could she have really been abducted by aliens? So I liked how, it kind of kept that, as an interesting perspective. Like it is a possibility. Like, I'm not going to say like, what exactly happens, but I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Did you always know like how you were going to structure this? Were you going to put the entries in there? Were you going to structure it a little differently to start with?
Well, I knew when I started that I wanted to tell this from Mallory's point of view. So Mallory is one of Jennifer's bullies. And I remember when I was being bullied in middle school, I really turned to books and I was looking for really any story that I could find about bullying to help me process it and understand it. And I found a lot of books about the kid who was being bullied from that point of view. And that was really nice. And I felt like, oh, I'm not alone in this experience. There's other kids who are dealing with this too. But I was really looking also for books from the point of view of the bullies because I wanted to know what was going through their heads and why it happened. And I couldn't really find any books like that. So I knew all these years later that that's the point of view I wanted to write from. But I also didn't want to lose Jennifer Chan because I felt like it was really important to give her a voice. And so that's how I kind of thought for a while, maybe I'll do different point of view chapters, but I settled on doing it all from Mallory's point of view with sprinkles of Jennifer Chan's journals, because I felt like that would give a good balance. And Jennifer in the journals on the surface is kind of talking about her research about aliens and her findings about space, but really underneath all of that is the way that she thinks about the world, the way that she thinks about belief in general, how she believes in herself and in the goodness of other people. And also you start to get her backstory about who she is. So I liked having that balance of, even though it's not in real time, even though she's not directly commenting on the events of the book, still getting her perspective in the story.
Yeah, I thought that that was wonderful. I mean, you get such well fleshed out characters because you see, the bullies being, we're seeing from the bullies' perspective of things, Jennifer's bullies, but we see that there's so much more to a person than sometimes we see through their actions. Like we see that, people are not all bad. And sometimes when we read books, we get such a stark contrast. Like these are the good characters and these are the bad characters. I love in this book that it leads, there's such like more like, less borders between like such a stark contrast of things. It's like there's so much unknown about a person, until you really get to know them. And I feel like that's like how you're doing research too. It's like how Jennifer is doing her research on space. You're doing your research on these characters, like as you're reading, and you learn so much. So that's so interesting. It's like a character study on each of the characters.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember too when I was in middle school and I was looking at all of those books, the way that I started to kind of understand and build a framework about what happened in my life was those very stark labels for everybody and thinking of people as very static caricatures almost. And I understand kind of why I was drawn to that, at 12. But when I was writing now, I did want to kind of write as a way to maybe lead kids away from those static labels.
Yes, I think that that's so important for kids to see that too, and then maybe you can work through some of this bullying. Maybe there's a way you can have better communication to work through some of this. And like, maybe even the bullies that might be reading this book can maybe see, oh, wow, like I didn't see things from that perspective. Like maybe if I just changed my perspective of things and got to know someone, then I wouldn't prejudge someone. So I think that it's a book that can really, lead kids to think in a more positive way, like, towards each other too. What I also wanted to ask you with is when you were younger, did you keep a journal?
Yeah. So I actually, when I was being bullied, I kept a journal of what happened. I still have some of those entries, which I went back to when I was writing Jennifer Chan. And something that I kept doing when I was in middle school was I was trying to write these little short stories, both from my own perspective, kind of like a journal entry of what happened, but also write these fictionalized stories about what the other kids were thinking. And I remember even then I was trying to understand, but really, I mean, reading and writing both were ways for me to escape what was happening and also ways for me to try to process what was happening.
Yeah, that's what the journal seems like, almost therapeutic for Jennifer in the book. And I like your other previous books, you've dealt with the topic of grief. And that's dealt with too in this book. A character loses, someone very very important in their life. And like, can you talk a little bit about that, like grief and how that, how you develop that in your stories? And like, because I know that in you, When You Trap a Tiger, like, that was a different kind of story. That was a that was folk tales and folklore. And this is kind of a mix of genre mixing. So how do you like to write grief, especially geared towards children, in a way that, is accessible to them? Because I think you do it in such a good way. Like, yeah, so that.
Yeah, I think that it can be really hard, and as adults, there is a tendency to want to protect children and want to shield them from these ideas of grief and loss, and kind of this hope that, if we don't talk about it, if we don't, expose them to this, then they won't ever have to deal with it, which of course isn't true. And there are a lot of kids who are going through grief and loss, and I feel like putting it into a book and kind of giving them a space there to understand what's happening is kind of a safe, accessible place, especially now in the world that we live in, where the internet exists and they can, go on Google and find, a whole range of things. Some things might be helpful, some things might be less helpful. Being able to give them a narrative that is structured in a safe way and is really guided towards, acknowledging that it happens and really sitting with them in those feelings, but also moving them through those feelings towards an ending that is hopeful and uplifting.
Yeah. And I especially see that in your books. There's always, no matter what, the topic is, or, whatever the conflict is in the story, there's always a feeling of hope. And like, I think that that's so important for kids, especially, to read about. And there's some strong like figures. Like, I think Mallory's mother is a strong figure in the story, and she gives her a lot of good advice. Especially I think when Mallory's dealing with some, identity, dealing with her own identity in school. And I think that that's very important, that we have some positive, positive adult figures in books too, for Mallory. Her mother, I think, is very positive to her. Can you talk a little bit about like identity in this book, and like what you want kids to, I think, to get out of, what do you want like your reader, not just kids, but adults too, to get out of this book? Because I certainly feel like I got a lot out of it.
Thanks. Yes, well, first, what you're saying about the adult characters is something that I tried to be really intentional about in this book. I think that there's kind of a joke with children's book writers that adults are so hard because they really get in the way. They're like, you want your kid characters to be going on these adventures and doing all these things, but adults and parents in the books and, in real life don't want their kids going on all of these dangerous adventures. And so sometimes, you find the trope of like orphan kids because the parents are, going to stop them from going out into the world. But I kind of wanted to flip that on its head. And Mallory really feels in the beginning of the book that, her parents don't understand. They're kind of preventing her from doing things that she wants to do and that she feels is right, especially when she's looking for Jennifer. But I wanted to show as the book goes on that if Mallory is able to turn to her parents and really talk to them about what's going on, then they can help her and kind of be an ally in what she's trying to do. And one of those ways is with identity. So Mallory talks to her mom about her biracial identity being part Korean and part white. And I think that for Mallory, she's kind of at the beginning of her journey in understanding her racial identity. And as kind of a white passing character in a community that is very much white, she's at a point where she has never really wanted to think about her race because that puts her outside of the norm. And she is someone who really wants to always fit in. But I wanted to show her kind of opening up and embracing different parts of her and celebrating it in a way, the things that make her who she is and that make her different.
Yeah, I thought that that was so wonderful, and it's great to have characters with all different, cultural backgrounds, and like we can see, because that's wonderful. And and also seeing like in the community, like I know that there was one character said something like, oh, they're Chinese, and it's like no, but like they're Korean too, and it's just like like you can't just you know judge someone's culture like until you get to know them, and like really like they're not just identified by one culture. A lot of people
Mhm.
have they're made up of so many different cultures, even within that culture. So, I'm glad that we get to see that, Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah, it's never a monolith.
No. Um, yeah, and yeah, I love the structure of the book. And then as we go through, we see such like a depth of the character's development. Like in the beginning, like I wasn't sure if I was gonna like Mallory or not. And especially like her friend Reagan, I was like, oh, they're so judgmental, like in the beginning. And then like as the story goes on, you really get to, learn more about them. And like I think that they learn more about Jennifer. So it's like you're like, okay, like, there's definitely more to these characters than, you definitely see from the beginning of the story. Like,
I also didn't know if I was gonna like Mallory when I started
yeah,
writing
yeah,
the
just
book.
yeah, but I like that because it's like if you don't like in the beginning of the book, if you feel like, okay, I meet this character, like I know so much about them, and I'm like, oh, I'm just judging. I already like them or I dislike them. That's not an interesting story. But because Mallory is such a complex character and she's, well developed, like as we go through the story, she's a dynamic character, which I think a lot of the characters are. I don't think anyone stays completely the same, throughout the whole story. Everyone goes through a period of growth, and as like, you find out more about the journal entries and more about Jennifer's life, but then you're also seeing like some of the insides of the middle school. Like there was just some like funny scenes like in the school, like when the alarm keeps going off and then they're like, oh, like what's going on? It's just like I like how you put in like some of those like, oh, things that would go on in school too. And it's just like I think the readers will really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I really wanted it to feel real and authentic to middle school.
Yeah, because it's like it's like definitely not just a book about like science fiction, because you would think, okay, maybe reading the book, okay, it's gonna have like aliens in it. I'm like, oh wait, it's just something interesting, but it's like it's so much more than that. It's like, and there was, a lot of research, even into like how Jennifer's research into space. Like, did you do any specific research about space and aliens before this book? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I did a lot of research. So originally, when I was thinking about, oh, it's a book about aliens and Jennifer Chan believes in aliens, I was more focused on the conspiracy theory element of it. And my idea for Jennifer was that she was going to believe all of these really wild conspiracies. And I kind of tried a draft of the book where her journals were very much focused on that. And it didn't really fit and it didn't really feel right. And I realized that if her journals were all geared around, really wild kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy theories, then it kind of led the reader to make fun of Jennifer Chan, which wasn't what I wanted. I wanted them to kind of uh, open up to her, kind of have her curiosity spark their own, maybe go along with her a little bit and learn something new. And so I realized that there was definitely going to be this alien aspect to it. And I referenced some conspiracy theories like Area 51, but I wanted it to also be very grounded in fact and science. And so I ended up reading a lot about astrophysics and astronomy and string theory, which was really mind-boggling. But I found a lot of really interesting science to put into the book and hopefully help balance out the more out there alien piece of it.
Yeah, I definitely can tell you did a lot of research, because it was just even fun just reading that aspect of Jennifer's research. I was like, wow, I'm learning something about space and more about science that I didn't know before. And that was really interesting and cool, because you see so many like TV shows about like, oh, science and aliens, and you're like, oh, this is so like far-fetched. And it's like, but it's like still within like a realistic background of the story where you blend some of the science fiction element that like makes it so fascinating. So that was very interesting. And I was wondering why you chose Florida actually as the setting.
So there was a number of reasons. First was I was thinking about setting this in my hometown, which is Honolulu. But that ended up not working because I wanted Mallory and Jennifer to be in a very white community, and Hawaii is very Asian and biracial. And so I was thinking that it had to be on the mainland. And then I was thinking it had to be a warm state because Jennifer Chen goes missing, and I didn't want there to be any thought of like, oh my God, what if she's outside in winter time? I didn't want the reader to have to go there. So I knew it had to be warm. And then I was looking into the southern states, and Florida had the most UFO sightings. And so I thought, okay, Florida it is. And I ended up doing a research trip, and I drove around the state for a couple days and kind of tried to find where my fictional town would be located and get a sense of the weather, the houses, what the neighborhoods look like, all of that.
That's so cool. So it was the southern states that had more of the sightings in the US, but Florida had the most sightings.
Yeah.
That's so cool. See, that's another aspect you could tell, like, wow, you did so much research for this. Like, yeah. And it was like, yeah, it was like wondering, like, so yeah, like what happened when she went missing? And you're in such a big state. So it was like, oh, how are they gonna find her? Like, it's just like the mystery. Like, did you always enjoy mysteries growing up when you were reading? When you were reading and writing too? Like,
yeah. Actually, my first heavy quotations books that I wrote when I was maybe 3 or 4 was this whole series of detective books about my stuffed animals, and they were trying to find all these missing things. So I always loved mysteries, and reading mysteries. But this is the first time I've really tried to write a mystery, and it was a lot. It was a lot of moving pieces to keep in my head.
Yeah, it was. So you did such an amazing job though. I'm like, you must have like, because in your other books there's mystery elements I would find in some of your other books, but this was really like, oh, I could, I see this like as a mystery and science fiction, realistic fiction, but like the whole mystery, that's like, I read this book in like only a matter of like maybe 2 hours. It was just so interesting. I was just like, wow, you must have a background in mystery. So I'm like, glad you told me about how you used to write those little stories. That's so cool.
Yeah, one of my really good writer friends, Lauren Magaziner, she writes a series of mysteries, like choose your own adventure detective stories. And so I would just, the whole time I was writing, I would be texting her like, how do you do this? How do you write a mystery? She had a lot of good advice.
Yeah. So you said originally like you were going to write in multiple different perspectives, like from point of views, I should say, from the different characters. So did Jennifer Chan, does she have other point of view perspectives throughout the story? Like instead of the journal entries, you were going to have like just where she was? I know like you can't say like exactly like not knowing to the other characters, like we would know, but the other characters wouldn't know where she was.
Yeah, and actually, so the whole process of writing this book took about 20 different drafts. And when I got to maybe draft 10, I was still really struggling with Mallory's point of view, and trying to make her relatable and empathetic, and I was having a hard time getting into her head. And I thought, maybe I wasn't able to write from Mallory's point of view, and I shouldn't try to do that. And so I shifted gears and I wrote an entire draft in Jennifer Chan's point of view. So I have a whole draft that is fully, exclusively Jennifer Chan's point of view. And when I tried writing that, and I felt like her experience is closer to my real life experience in middle school, and so it'd be easier. And I wrote that, and it was easier to write. But when I was finished with it, I reread the draft, and I just felt like it really has to be from Mallory's point of view, because ultimately I wanted to write a book about redemption, and I wanted to write a book about self-reflection and being able to look at yourself and your own mistakes, as opposed to looking out and looking at other people's mistakes and the way that other people hurt others in the community. I wanted it to be something that kind of turned that light inward. And so then I went back to focusing on Mallory. But there were definitely drafts along the way that did have Jennifer Chen's point of view in it.
So when you wrote from Mallory's perspective, did you find it was just flowing a lot easier than when you tried to write from like Jennifer, like also from these different perspectives, the story just like evolved, like not easier, but it just kind of like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it was actually easier to write from Jennifer's point of view. But I think that it was much more important, and I think it was a better story writing from Mallory's point of view. And I think I had to let myself sit in that self-reflection and be uncomfortable and say, okay, even though, you know, in some of the incidents that the bullying in the book is based off of in my real life, even if I was closer to Jennifer, there were certainly times in my life where I did make mistakes, or I hurt people, or I regret it. And I do hope that readers will come to it. And even if they, you know, hopefully they don't identify as a bully. But I think that so many readers will be able to think, oh yeah, there was this time that I said something that I regret and it came off mean, and I didn't know how to fix it. Or, you know, I saw someone being bullied and I was too afraid to say something. And so I think a lot of people have those memories, or are currently, for kids, experiencing that feeling of, you know, you're not necessarily being the person that you want to be or that you hope to be, and trying to find a way towards that better version of yourself.
yeah, I think that that's so beautiful because yeah, kids will definitely, adults will get out of this just so much more than their typical book about middle school. Like it's just because you don't, like when you see yourself, you don't necessarily like identify, like the bully wouldn't know like sometimes that they're the one that's being the bully until like they go and like, wow, did I do something like that? Did I say something like that that was wrong? Like, oh, like it makes you think, you know, twice, like maybe I should think, you know, more before saying something and like be aware of the other person. So it has so much strength, you know, behind that, and besides the other elements to the story. If you had advice for anyone who wanted to write, like what advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a good question. So the advice that I usually give kids when they ask is to remember to have fun with it, because I think, especially now, I see a lot of kids starting to get anxious about one day being an author, and are they on the right track, and are they, you know, following all the advice perfectly. And I think that that can be very stressful and overwhelming. And so I always try to give the advice to remember what is exciting about writing for them, whether that's the characters that they're creating, or the plots that they're building, or, you know, the whole world, or just the message that they're trying to share, to for them to focus on that part of writing that brings them joy, and to run with it and enjoy it. And then the advice that I think is true for, you know, kids all the way to adults is to read. Because when I started writing full time, I had this feeling like, okay, now that I'm writing full time, I have to always be writing, and I have to spend all my time doing that because I have this opportunity and I don't want to waste it. And I was trying to write so much that I wasn't leaving any time for reading. And I kind of felt like reading was a luxury that I didn't want to think about. And I found that my writing really began to suffer because I wasn't getting inspiration. I wasn't learning new things from books and writers. And so now I really build reading into my job. And I think of it really as part of the writing process, both for researching for stories, but also just for knowing what else is out there and knowing how other writers build their books.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you so much for your writing advice. And we're so excited that your book is now out. It's Jennifer Chen is Not Alone. Thank you, Tae, for joining us today. It's been great I love talking about your book with you. It was an amazing book, and I'm definitely going to be recommending it to everyone I know, because I know that this is a book for everyone. It's not just for kids. It's for teens, it's for adults, it's for, anyone looking for, a good story. And I just can't recommend it enough. I really loved it. So
Thank you so much.
all right. So this is Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page. I am Meghan Fangman, signing off here with author Tae Keller. And please check out Jennifer Chan Is Not Alone.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.